The wait has been long, unkindled one. I am Emma, High Priestess of Lothric Castle. Allow me to speak frankly. You will not find the Lords of Cinder here. They have left, gone, to their journey homes converging at the base of this castle.
Yes, indeed. It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge.
Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora, and welcome back to Dark Souls 3 Let's Talk Lore. This is episode number 3 being recorded on Friday the 2nd of September. I hope you're all having a fantastic day whenever it is you find yourself watching this. She didn't join in the greeting. I guess I already knew that was going to happen, but still. I thought maybe if we stood next to her that she'd do a little bow while sitting or something. So we have a lot of stuff to go through in this episode. In no small part because of the number of really incredibly insightful and helpful, thought-provoking comments that were left on the previous episode. But before we get to that, I should also point out that after I had finished compiling the myriad comments that we're going to discuss in this episode, JSF together with Theomany or Cassidiv released just a torrent of content. JSF on his YouTube channel released a 9-part series of videos called Discussing Dark Souls 3 with Cassidiv, wherein they just discuss, as the title suggests, they discuss Dark Souls 3 but on an area by area basis. So there are nine episodes in total, ranging from something like 12 minutes to half an hour or so. And we are going to, I will probably be referring to them in an unorganized way throughout this episode. Or possibly also saying things and not remembering that that's where I heard it from. Because I basically binge-watched the whole 9-episode series, if you will, in the last 24 hours. And that was after having spent 3 or 4 hours compiling comments and just having all these things in my head that I want to talk about in this episode. So all of this is to say that I will leave a link in the video description to the playlist containing all 9 episodes. And I will put it in the video description below because it's really, really insightful. And we are going to be talking about several of the issues raised in this series of videos. We won't be doing it in a structured way today. If I see something that brings to mind something I saw in one of these episodes, then I will mention that. But a more in-depth look at these episodes is forthcoming. Theomany or Cassidiv or Diana also released a second essay, similar in format to the first essay that she released in that series, titled Ash Seeketh Embers, which we discussed in the first episode. This one is called Dream Chasers. And again, I'll leave a link in the video description below. I'd highly recommend checking it out. We're not going to be discussing it really in this episode beyond the general the general gist, which you can see from this snippet view here, that history degrades and truth fades into legend and myth. And if you've seen Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore, you may recall that that was one of the things, if not the thing, that first that I found so compelling about Dark Souls at first. In particular, the story of Artorias, and how Artorias was, just this legend, did all these great things, and then you go back in the DLC and you find out that no, that's really not what happened. And in many ways, the way in which the Dark Souls series of games handles history and historical memory mirrors that of the real world. And so that's what I find most compelling about it. And so, yeah, I'll leave a link to that essay in the video description below. And that's obviously something that I'll be discussing with Cassidiv when she joins us on the show. I do have several potential guests lined up, and the list is probably too large as it is. But I'm still trying to work out the details of the who, what, when, where, why, so on and so forth. So stay tuned for that. I probably won't announce guests in advance, save for the one that I already have, and that is Theomeny in the Untended Graves, because of the essay she wrote. But there are several other people who I've asked whether they're interested in being on the show. And so, yeah, we'll see. I personally don't really understand the Swordmaster, where he's from, what the point of him being here is. Beyond the simple fact that we find him here, we also find him in the Untended Graves. And if I recall correctly, the only other place you can summon him other than the Untended Graves is outside of Vordt, the Vordt's boss room, at the foot of the high wall. So what is he doing here? And as I said, something that Theomeny and JSF pointed out, or Cassidiv and JSF, is confusing when so many names. I know her by Theomeny because, if I recall correctly, she first started, we first started discussing all this stuff when I was live streaming, and on Twitch her username is Theomeny, but on YouTube it's Cassidiv. So, but what they mentioned in their discussing Dark Souls 3 videos is that he's standing in front of. They drew attention to the fact that he's standing in front of this tower here. And what do we find in this tower when we go there later on? We find just piles of dead Firekeeper bodies, piles of dead Firekeepers, in other words. And we also find him in the Untended Graves, where he offers himself up to be summoned in order so that he can help you defeat Champion Gunder. So, I don't know. Maybe he feels sympathy for the Firekeepers. Maybe he's upset at Champion Gunder for how he failed the one Firekeeper in particular that was supposed to be his Firekeeper. I don't know. But as always, I'm interested in hearing what everyone else thinks. I suppose before we get to that, I should also mention that I did a fair bit of leveling up through just farming in the High Wall, as well as doing a fair bit of Jolly Cooperation. So we are now at level 30. I brought intelligence up to 10 so that we could, I believe it's 10 that you need to in order to do Orbeck's quest line. So we want to make sure that we're able to do all the quest lines. And so that's why our intelligence is at 10. And even though I've infused even though I've infused the Astora sword with raw, which means that we currently get no benefits from scaling. I have already begun to level up strength and dex, just because that's something I do, especially when it's supposed to be a jack-of-all-trades build like this. And then you'll also notice that I have 99 embers and what was 96 homeward bones, and that's because the Memetim kindly offered to drop me some things, and he also dropped me a bunch of souls of a champion, which I put in the item box so as to avoid tempting myself for the time being with that. But yeah, so thank you kindly. Huge shout out to the Memetim for offering, and then giving me all that stuff. I did say that I didn't want any equipment because I want us to be able to pick up equipment through the course of doing the playthrough, so that we can discuss it in the context in which it was meant to be discussed, where it's discovered. And I don't know to what extent I will use the souls to level up, like where our build is right now. That was all done through farming. But I'm especially grateful just because I don't think I have it in me to spend as much time off camera farming as I did for Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore, because I spent an absurd amount of time farming in that game. But of course you can't drop items for other players in that game, so that's a huge I don't want to say problem, but it made it difficult in order to do the series. I felt like I needed to be at a certain level and do certain things, but I'm rambling now. Okay, Swordmaster. So time for us to die, I assume. Oh no! Oh no! Well, that kind of sucks. I'm going to assume that if we reload the area, it will go back to where he previously was. So let's hope that that's the case. A unique katana characterized by the fine craftsmanship of an eastern land where it was forged. The finely sharpened blade cuts flesh like butter and causes bleeding, but breaks easily as a result. Master's attire, a terribly worn shirt. Men are fond of weaving tales to explain the raggedness of their garb. My sixth sense warned me of danger, and I danced between flurries of blades unscathed. But alas, my clothes went to tatters. So yeah, I don't... I don't really know what to think about that. But as I was mentioning previously, and of course we will be exploring this area later on, but you can just see the horrors of whatever just... Oh man, that's brutal. That is so brutal, and we'll return to talk about that. But as far as the introduction goes, oh, and I forgot about the East-West shield. Whoops. No, I thought you guys were passive. As far as the introduction goes, we'll actually discuss it. We'll go back and we'll speak with Emma again, and we'll discuss it at that point. But in the meantime, we actually have a fair bit of dialogue to get here, so let's get to that.
O thou unkindled, and a seeker of lords, I am Ludleth of Courland. Look not in bewilderment as I say. I linked the fire long ago, becoming the Lord of Cinder. If substantiation be thy want, set thine eyes upon my charred corpse. This sad cadaver. No need to be coy. Have a closer look.
If substantiation be thy want. So if you want substantiation. Another definition I should have looked up, but that I didn't.
Knowest thou of our purpose? 5 thrones will take 5 lords as kindling for the linking of the fire. The fast-fading flame must be licked to preserve this world. A reenactment of the first linking of the fire. So it is, I became a Lord of Cinder. I may be but small, but I will die a Colossus.
So a reenactment of the first linking of the flame. And this is very interesting, and not something I think I would have honed in on had I not, just binge-watched that whole series by JSF and Theomany, or Cassidiv. But yeah, there seems to be this obsession with several of the characters with living up to or taking on the mantle of heroes of ages past, or of the current state of the historical record, or the historical consensus as to what these people did, what the significance of those actions were, and then setting about to replicate what they did, to live up to strive to be like them, even though the passage of time has distorted the historical record, our understanding of the history of the world, and B, as a result of that, as a result of the enormous loss of context and detail and specificity, that a lot of these people are trying to live up to legends that stories about whom are not even necessarily true, but they're trying to do these things and live up to these legends that they don't really understand themselves. And yeah, so it's very interesting. Then he mentions, it's a reenactment of the first linking of the flame. And also that, even though he's small, he will die a giant. And, that's another really important part of history. And that is, in order to be remembered at all, let alone to be remembered as a giant, you need to be regarded as important enough to begin with to have records, historical records kept of the things that you've done. Or failing that, you had to have been, of a sufficient... You had to have sufficient wherewithal, of a sufficient class and sufficient privilege in order to be able to leave records of things that you've done yourself. In order to leave things for for later historians, if they're looking at you and the things you've done. You need to leave a trail of breadcrumbs, you need to leave some historical evidence of the things that you've done. But in the case of Ludleth, and a few case studies I've read about in the last few years, of scientists that purposely leave records that skew the historical narrative in the direction that they were hoping to skew it. So a really fantastic example of this is a book called The Calcutta Chromosome by Amitav Ghosh. I'm either remembering that name wrong or almost certainly butchering the pronunciation, but effectively it shows, it's a science fiction novel, but effectively it shows that you can take the same historical evidence, the same textual evidence, and you can turn it on its head and tell a completely different story than the evidence might otherwise suggest, A, but B, that the person intended. So, yeah, I'm not going to get into that, but that was my reading of the Calcutta chromosome. And, yeah, we seem to be seeing something similar here, where Ludleth has done things because he wants to be remembered after he's gone. Which is totally relatable, at least to me, because, you know, I think to a certain degree we all want to be remembered after we're gone, right?
Knowest thou of our treat the firekeeper not with discourtesy. She is much like thee, prisoners both, kept to link the fire.
First of all, you don't really know me, Ludleth, if you're telling me not to treat the firekeeper poorly. And second of all, yeah, even though he withholds a fair bit of information, and you can see he's actually ember. That's something I never noticed before. You can see the embers traveling up and down his garb there. That's fascinating. And makes perfect sense. Just as you can see that his throne is embered too. But yeah, he outright tells us, even though he knows way more than he's letting on, he outright tells us that we are, much like the firekeeper, together, we're imprisoned here. So again, I think perhaps lending further credence to Cassitive's theory about this being some sort of, if not purgatory proper, or, you know, a particular interpretation of purgatory, then this seems almost certainly to be some sort of a Dreamlands type area. And that is to say, if you didn't watch Bloodborne Let's Talk lore, the Dreamlands, you know, they're not dreams in an Inception sense, where you're inside of someone's mind. They are dreams, they're dreams in the sense that it's an alternate dimension, but even though it's called the Dreamlands, they're called the Dreamlands. The place is as real as the real world. So, I don't really know, but we need to go talk to Greirat, so there's something to think about for now.
Oh, hello, you're back. And in one piece. Well, now it's time I do my part. Whatever trinket you need, speak up. Just don't ask me where I've got them. Do me a favor and don't forget our promise. Give this ring to old Loretta at the base of the high wall. A nuisance, I know, but it will help me tie up some loose ends. Do me a favor. Goodbye, and stay safe. Oh, this place is a bore. What good is thievery if you've nowhere to go?
And further to what I was, again, in the latter half of the previous episode, I was rushing a little bit, and I'm going to try my best not to do that going forward, because there were several things I really ought to have mentioned, but that I didn't. You may recall that in the previous episode, after he warped away from the prison cell in which we found him, I cut away from his warping and showed how it looks like when the player character warps, and then showed the two side by side. Put simply, it's the exact same effect. So the question then becomes, how did he come here? And the answer seems to be that this place is some sort of... I don't want to relate it too closely to Bloodborne because I don't think that they're the same. And beyond that, the notion of the host of the nightmare and Bloodborne, or the host of the dream, was, I think, a source of enormous confusion for many, and in some cases was less helpful than, had we not talked about that at all. But if you were to try and apply that in Dark Souls 3, it seems as though Firelink, that is our Firelink, because there's a multitude of Firelinks, for us and for other players, for other unkindled ash, that this place, if you were to assign a host to it, it would seem to be in part hosted by the Firekeeper and in part hosted by us. So based, at least in part, on what Ludleth said about the two of us being imprisoned here to link the fire. And again, something that JSF and Cassett have mentioned in their videos was that it's really not terribly surprising that this place is so strikingly reminiscent of the Nexus. Because in Demon Souls, you are bound to the Nexus via the Nexial Binding, I think it's called. So when we come across an NPC in the world, and I know that this is, at least early on, it was a major source of contention of the few blind playthroughs I watched. More often than not, the warping away of NPCs was kind of scoffed at, like, oh, that's so stupid. Which I don't agree with, because I don't think it's any more or less stupid, or at least I don't think it's any more stupid than having them just stand there and say, oh, no, don't worry. I'll meet you there. I'm just going to stand here while you walk away. But on the other hand, it's also worth noting that when you come across an NPC and they ask to serve you, if you say no, they don't warp away. So you're giving them consent to join you to join you as the player character in this place, which seems, at least in part, to be hosted by yourself, and at least in part to be hosted by the Firekeeper. And yeah, so I think that's really fascinating. Loretta. So he gives us the blue Tearstone ring, a ring set with a large rare Tearstone jewel, temporarily boosts damage absorption when HP is low. This stone is said to be a tear of sorrow of the goddess Keitha, and of course, tears are always more beautiful near death. So the first time I played, I was, I don't want to say bewildered, but I really couldn't see any need or reasoning behind why he would want us to give the blue Tearstone ring to Loretta. Well, it's worth noting that he says that Loretta is, he calls her Old Loretta. So I was thinking at first that maybe Loretta is his mother, because he doesn't seem that elderly, although it's hard to tell. But the way he talks about her doesn't really seem... if anything, I think she might be a mother figure to him. Based on his reaction after we find Loretta's bone, which of course we'll get to later. But the point I wanted to make, something that came to me yesterday when I was preparing for this episode, is that this is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Temporarily boost damage absorption when HP is low. So he presumably left the Undead settlement and headed for the High Wall, as thieves are wont to do in this world, particularly those from the Undead settlement. They stay away from Castle Lothric proper, but they do run amok at the High Wall. And so he set out, I think, to find not necessarily a cure, but something that can help Loretta. And so if she's elderly and if she's dying, it makes perfect sense. It's so brilliant when you think about it. That he got this ring, he wanted to get it back to her, Because if he got it back to her on time, maybe she would be alright. If she was dying, if, so to speak, she was in blue tearstone mode or range of the amount of HP she has. So yeah, so I think that is really, really interesting. So I think that's it for Firelink for now. Although, scratch that, I think I see Leonard, or Leonhard, actually.
Unkindled, are we? And fast on the trail of the Lords absconded? Then these red eyes are for you. Use them to pillage embers and briefly heighten your strength for your duty. What else are unkindled ashes good for? Pillage embers for briefly heightened strength for your duty. What else are unkindled ashes good for?
Cracked Red Eye Orb. Allows a single invasion of another world. Defeat the host of embers of the world you have invaded to gain the strength of fire. The Cracked Red Orb is far from perfect, it seems, as Ringfinger Leonhard knows all too well. It's so much easier to just call him Leonard, but... Okay, let's head back to the High Wall. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are a lot of comments we need to get to in this episode. Starting with Robert, who writes, "This is all speculation, and I apologize if this has already been addressed by someone, but I feel that the Hollow Trees could be a stage in the Hollows that we find reaching for the sky's ascension into those weird dragon butterfly that are present around the Dragon Slayer armor and other areas of Upper Lothric." So, I don't think that the Hollow Trees are connected explicitly to those flying things you mentioned, which appear to be a later form of the Pilgrims, based on their name, which I have the guide, but I've not yet looked this up, although I've been meaning to see whether or not their official name is in fact Pilgrim Butterflies, but I think it is. I'm reasonably certain that it is. So though they may not be an earlier form of the Pilgrim Butterflies, it is possible that they are reaching out for a similar thing. So that whatever compelled them, provided that it's not just madness, it's not just a Mad Hollow doing Mad Hollow things, just Mad Hollow things, I suppose. But the Pilgrim Butterflies all seem to be trying to reach, and the Pilgrims in general, all seem to be trying to reach a common place. And it's entirely possible that the Hollow Trees are also trying to reach out to the same place that the Pilgrim Butterflies are, and the Pilgrims more generally. Sebastian writes, "Maybe the absolute end result of hollowing is becoming a hollow tree. It would be a clever wordplay. After seeing that Yorm had an actual face, I began to wonder if giants are also capable of hollowing. If they can link the flame, or at least attempt to, could they also be under the influence of the undead curse? That would explain why the giants in Dark Souls 2 look the way they do. They are hollow. Maybe normal giants have faces." Another note regarding the hollow trees and giant trees. The story revolving around the first flame may help us understand. Maybe giants and humans/hollows are connected to the giant arch trees in some way. Maybe not transforming, but reverting. For his part, Dezo Penguin writes, "The hollow trees are something I'd never really thought about before, but they do actually stand well alongside something that I've been thinking about for a while. The world as it presently is, meaning warped and changed with bits and pieces of the world hauled together through space and possibly, not necessarily, through time. like jigsaw puzzle pieces, has stood that way for quite some time. So that there have been events of history that took place during this period of time. So one thing that I would note in response to what Deso Penguin said about space and possibly not necessarily through time. I do think that at least, insofar as we are in a world, that we are presently in a world which obeys, at least generally speaking, the same laws of physics as we understand them in our world, then I would say that space, or that time is necessarily tied to space. Hence the notion of space-time. And that's why time is relative, depending on how close you are to a massive object, or on how close you are traveling towards the speed of light. So, yeah, I don't know how deep I want to get into the physics aspect of it, because again, I want to make sure that I've done proper research, but we do have a comment which speaks to this. But yeah, space and time are inextricably connected to each other. At least in our world, and insofar as this world obeys something resembling the laws of physics that as we know them, then yeah, space and time have to be connected. So Rince Windus writes, "You missed the statue and banner in the room you first teleport to in the High Wall. They got a bunch of foreshadowing in early." And Rince Windus also points out that you can't see Firelink Shrine from Lothric Castle. It's behind the main tower the Twin Princes are in. You can, however, see the area that Firelink overlooks from the bridge to the Twin Princes, and they don't match up at all. The mountains surrounding Lothric are pretty much level or higher with the High Wall, and instead of running up to the High Wall, they instead merge into a grassy plain that fades into mist before they reach the High Wall. Firelink's skybox does, however, match the skybox in Flameless Shrine. So very, very interesting, but returning to the first part of this comment. So I did indeed miss a statue here. I don't know if I've ever even looked at this statue. So hinting perhaps at the angelic faith in Lothric Castle proper, because we do find this gargoyle all throughout Lothric Castle and I believe the Grand Archives. The banner. So provided I'm looking at the right banner here, I don't really know what I'm looking at or for. I suppose the sigil could be said to resemble, I don't really know. So in the future, if you don't mind, if you're leaving a comment like that saying you missed something, there's a bunch of foreshadowing, give me a couple sentences, hint at what it is that I'm supposed to be looking for. Because I don't really know what I'm looking for on the banners here. I'm sure it's something I missed. Am I supposed to be looking at this thing, that diamond-shaped thing, and assuming that it's similar to the dark sign in the sky? Or is this supposed to depict a monster of some sort? I don't know. But yeah, I do appreciate Rince Windus for drawing our attention, because as soon as we warped here, I got fixated on the coiled sword there, and I didn't bother looking up. And I don't believe I even looked up during my blind playthrough either. But yeah, very interesting, but do let me know what I'm supposed to be seeing in that banner there, because There may be something, but I just don't know what it is. Okay, so that's it for the comments for now. I've arranged the comments on my PC next to me so that shh, people are sleeping, friend. I arranged the comments on my computer next to me so that as we travel through the area, they will be in order. The next comment actually comes from Mitch L, who has done a fair bit of Dark Souls 3 lore stuff, but is presently diving into Bloodborne lore. And his videos are really, really well done. I guess similar in style to those which JSF does for Bloodborne. And speaking of which, that torrent of content I mentioned earlier, JSF also released a second Bloodborne Up Close episode on revisiting the Hunter's Dream, the Doll, and Lawrence. So I didn't mention it earlier because it's not technically related to Dark Souls 3, but if you're a fan of that series, which you should be, I would highly recommend checking that out. Just as I would recommend checking out Mitch's content, because it's quite good. But yeah, I'll put links in the description to that, but in the meantime, Mitch writes, Lothric Knights were known to ride dragons, yes, specifically dragons, and the deserter's outfit is probably linked to the possibility that there may have been deserters from the ranks of the Lothric army during the civil war between the kingdom and the angelic faith. So I mentioned that they have drops, which indicates that they're deserters, so I was actually able to pick something up, which says, Common Soldier's Armor. Its insignia is worn beyond recognition. This musty, rusted hunk of metal befits one reduced to thievery. So again, I think this is something that JSF and Cassidy have mentioned in that series of videos, but it seems almost that when things started going down at the High Wall, or in Lothric in general, that they closed up shop, so to speak. They wanted to ensure that no one would be able to enter Lothric Castle proper. And so they seem to have locked out all of the soldiers, friendly or otherwise, who were presently occupying the High Wall. So in situations like that, where these soldiers have nowhere to go, their families are presumably long gone or very, very far away, in order to survive this horrible, horrible situation and whatever's happening in the world right now, they would need to have access to food and supplies or something. But instead, they've been essentially left to rot, just like this wyvern here, that is dissipating into ash. It can almost be seen as, yeah, symbolic of what everyone else here is going through. It's just withering away. So yeah, so in that context, it's really, really hard to blame them for deserting. Sorry, friends. We also got a comment from JSF, which again was left after I compiled all the comments for this episode, so I don't have it on hand. But if I recall correctly, basically the gist of the comment was, try not to concern yourself too much with the whole distinction between dragons, wyverns, and drakes and all that, because to some degree they seem to be used as interchangeable terms. Because I believe that's something, Mitch writes that the Lothric Knights were known to ride dragons. But in the item description here it says that The knight has served as one of the 3 pillars since ancient times, and shares its place alongside the wyverns as a symbol of Lothric. Only those possessing a knight's resolve are fit to wear this garment. And then if we look at the Lothric's Knight Sword, it says that the Knights of Lothric, with their drakes, once crushed anything that threatened their shores. Of course, that was a long, long time ago. So, yeah, in other words, that's perhaps something, and I will very rarely say this, but that's perhaps something that we should maybe just not think too, or that at least I should probably not think too much about, because it just seems to distract me from the larger points that are considerably more important than that. So if you weren't aware of how to spot a mimic, just as it was in Dark Souls 1, if the chain is just sort of, you see it's curled, but it also straightens out at the end. Non-mimic chests are curled inwards. Mimic chests are curled, or not curled completely, they're kind of curled outwards, if anything. What's more is that you can also see it breathing. Okay, you know what? We're gonna kill this stupid dragon first, because he's making so much noise. Hopefully we have enough arrows to do it, though. No, crud. Okay, it appears as though we found the sweet spot. So while we're doing this, we might as well look at some additional comments. Robert writes on the possibility of there being a Lothric Civil War. My take was that half supported the princes in not linking the fire, and the other half wanted them to link the fire. The knights and hollows seem to be defending the princes, so maybe the winged knights and angelic winged knights are for linking, and the Lothric knights / hollows are against the linking. So I think that's very interesting, and I think that that's certainly a plausible reason for there to be a divide amongst the Lothric forces. But where I would perhaps disagree is in the suggestion that all those involved actually know what it is that they're fighting for. Because as is almost always the case when it comes to war, the people on the front lines very rarely have an actual understanding of, or are provided with enough information to adequately understand the reason why they're engaged in a conflict. And I think this is almost certainly true of hollows, who I don't think really even have the capacity to understand the pros and cons of a platform centered around linking the fire. Well, that's kind of disappointing. It just sort of disappears like that. So we got a large Titanite shard. I don't mind dragons, drakes, wyverns, whatever. But sometimes it winds up like that, where fighting them is just not interesting at all. Unless there's some way of fighting them that's more exciting than that, but that's really all I can think of. It's the only way I've ever scared off that wyvern. So I don't know. So we got a club, great axe, ember, claymore? No. Claymore's over there. So yeah, so I don't think that those who are on the other side of the conflict necessarily know why. Or on either side, for the most part. If for no other reason, then the majority of the forces, the bulk of the forces, are made up of hollows, as you suggested. So, but yeah, very interesting nevertheless. Okay, so finally, because I wanted to enhance the sound here so that you could hear the mimic soundly sleeping. But we weren't going to be able to do that with the dragon making all that noise. So yeah, so you can see it moving, and then if you use an Undead Hunter Charm, Deep Battle Axe. I love that. So, the Undead Hunter Charm. I don't think we've read the... Did we read the... Yeah, we did read the description for that. But the way it works in this game, I think it works this way in Dark Souls 1, but not in Dark Souls 2. And that is, if you want to get the Symbol of Avarice, then what you could do is, instead of killing it to get a small chance at that dropping, every time you use an Undead Hunter Charm, it actually resets. So if you don't get it the first time, that doesn't mean that you won't get it the second time. So rather than killing it, you can just sit there and use all 10 Undead Hunter Charms that you have on your person until you get it. And we were not so lucky, unfortunately. Okay, sleep well, Mrs. or Mr. Mimic. I enjoy that far more than I reasonably ought to. Okay, so I think what we'll do from here is we'll just, keep progressing through the area and then touch on all the things that we missed. We do want to read the description for the Deep Battle Axe, though. Deep Battle Axe, easily wielded axe crafted for battle and inflicting standard damage. Its weight can be used to inflict high damage, but must be used carefully as it leaves its wielder open to retaliation. So the description obviously says that it deals, or that it inflicts standard damage, which doesn't account for the fact that we have a deep battle axe here, or that it's infused with deep. So it's just a regular battle axe with deep infusion. And so the deep is something that we'll certainly be talking a fair bit about, especially when. And so I believe I said that I've only said something in advance about one of the guests, but JSF will be joining us for the first time at least, for Cathedral of the Deep. So obviously he's much more well-versed than me in Lovecraftian things. And as I mentioned early on, there are some ways in which the concurrent development of Bloodborne, or at least of whatever Miyazaki was interested in, or most keenly interested in during the development cycle of this game and Bloodborne, that Cthulhu stuff seems to play a much larger role in this game than it has in any of the prior Dark Souls games. And the Deep is a prime example of that. But I really don't know why there's a deep battle axe here. So a few commenters pointed out that with respect to my assertion that it's significant that this hollow here, I believe it's this hollow anyway, no, sorry friends. Yeah, it's that hollow. It was pointed out that that enemy can be seen as a semi-unique spawn, in that the first time you kill them, they drop, I believe, an Ember and a Titanite Shard. But each subsequent time you kill them, they... It's not so fun getting hit from a distance, is it, mister? But each subsequent time you kill them, they only have just a chance to drop whatever is on the drop tables of hollow enemies more generally. So you could look at that as, you know, and suggest that they're a semi-unique spawn, but I think that might be one place where... And so Dezo Penguin, I didn't raise this part of the comment in the episode, but I believe on the first episode he commented and raised the chart, the diagram, I don't even know what to call it, that I introduced during Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore, to show that you can integrate gameplay and story to a considerable degree, but you can never fully integrate them. There will always be just a little bit of gameplay things. You can't eliminate just gameplay things, that is, gameplay elements that don't really have story significance to them. It doesn't matter how hard you try, how good you are at storytelling, how good you are at game design, you're always going to have... It's literally impossible, because you are holding a controller in your hand, you're playing a video game, so there will always be some measure of things that aren't there for story reasons and are just there for gameplay reasons. And though you can debate what belongs where, but I think that the fact that they only drop an Ember and a Titanite Shard the first time you kill them is one of those instances where it kind of falls below this line here, and is more of a gameplay consideration than a lore one. But you know, the nature of this chart and the discussions in and around it is such that when I say that, it's really just my opinion. There's really no facts involved in all that, so take that with a grain of salt. So it could mean that, yeah, it's just a gameplay thing, but it could also just be that. It could be both. I don't know. I do think it's significant that those... Because, yeah, in Dark Souls 1 especially, there were so many unique spawns. Uniquely spawning enemies, where you kill them once and they're gone. And, yeah, I don't know. Something that I didn't point out that... Or at least that I couldn't have pointed out in the previous episode, because we didn't have the sword yet. But this is a Lothric Knight sword. So again, with respect to the whole Civil War thing, it seems apparent that this person was, yeah, the blue, I think, corresponding to the angelic faith. But I don't know. Oh, I meant to look up whether this guy can be parried, because I honestly have no clue whether he can or not. It doesn't stop me from trying every time, but let's see. They can be backstabbed, and I suppose that's all that really matters. So no drops, unfortunately. And I believe we've looted all the items here. Oh, crud, except for those. Okay. Yeah, when I was farming, I kept running by those items. So tempting to pick them up, but I obviously wanted to save that for the playthrough. So another thing from courtesy Theomany and Orcassitive and JSF is that this statue here, though that appears to be the Profane Greatsword, this figure does appear to be wearing the Robe of Prayer or something approximating it. And I believe that Cassitive posited that it's possible that even though, you know, as we find out later in the game, Prince Lothric, who I guess is technically King Lothric, is very weak and frail. So it would seem that this statue might be trying to depict him otherwise. But as with many other places in the game, we will have to return when we have the appropriate items to actually examine this. I don't know what kind of sword that is. It's not a Lothric Knight sword. Neither is it a claymore. So, I don't know. I am not sure. There does seem to be also something very peculiar about the culture within which the Lothric Knights are embedded. And that is, we find these statues here, but most prominently in Lothric Castle proper, of these knights holding their own heads. And what's more is that we have all of these Lothric Knights here, or at least suits of armor that once appeared to contain Lothric Knights. None of them have heads. And I'm reasonably certain I pointed that out in the previous episode, but yeah. So I think that's it in terms of the comments that we needed to cover here. But we do need to deal with all of the... Oh, we need to get this loot here first, actually. We need to deal with all the Lothric Knights here. So, Ring of Sacrifice. I believe that's connected to Velka. Let me see. Ring of Sacrifice. This mystical ring was created in a sacrificial rite of Velka, the goddess of sin. Its wearer will lose nothing upon death, but the ring itself breaks. A sacrifice is only worth as much as the life it spares. Lion Knight Albert. So, without exception, for one reason or another, all the Dark Souls 3 NPC summons are socially awkward. Oh, he's facing us. Don't scare him away. Because generally when you stop, they turn around and face the other way. And I presume their pathfinding is trying to ensure that they remain a certain distance away from the player character. And for whatever reason, that manifests itself as them appearing very socially awkward and not wanting to ever make eye contact with you. But yeah, he is wearing what, at least in Dark Souls 2, was known as the From set. I can't recall if that's what it's named here. He also has the Golden Wing Shield and a Great Axe. He's like, oh no, I wasn't following you. Great Axe resembling a hunk of raw iron. If one possesses the inhuman strength required to lift the weapon, the great heft of its attacks will send foes flying. However, since every swing makes use of one's entire body, attacks leave the wielder open to retaliation. It's not a whole lot there in the way of lore, but Lion Knight Albert is very closely affiliated with the Lothric regime. And this is demonstrated, interestingly enough, by the fact that if we were to go attack... Oh, I wonder what would happen if we did that. If we attacked Emma while Lion Knight Albert was summoned. We're not going to do that, but I do wonder what would happen. I do know, however, that if you attack Emma, thus summoning the dancer, Lion Knight Albert's summon sign, if you try to go into the boss room, maybe I'll do some testing after I'm done recording, I don't know. But he won't fight the dancer, is the short version of the story I'm trying to tell, but failing to do so. And so, it's been suggested, at least the last time I live streamed, I believe someone suggested this, that it seems like he's just trying to get you away from Lothric Castle. Albert, bring him up here, buddy. Ooh. Albert, just hang out for 1 second, friend. Shield of the renowned Lothric Knights, decorated with the royal crest. The Lothric Knights contended with dragons, and their shields have suitably high lightning absorption, befitting a dragon slayer's arms. Just hold on 1 sec, friend. He's so impatient. So yeah, so that's the crest of Lothric then, which appears very similar to, or not very similar. It's the same crest that we saw on the banner. In the room which first delivers us. Which Rince Windus attuned us to earlier. So that's very interesting, but still, I can't really see what I'm supposed to be seeing here. No matter. Let's go get Swordmaster. So yet again, socially awkward NPC summons. But that's fine. You guys are cool. I like you. So this is the entrance to the castle proper, which has, as I mentioned earlier, been sealed off. Thus perhaps necessitating been trying to fight these Lothric knights as though relax, guys, he's dead. He's dead. I've been trying to fight them as though I'm fighting them by myself. I need to remember that I have 2 summons with me. Long spear wielded by the proud Lothric knights, designed for long-range thrusting. Lothric spear knights are known for their steadfastness, and this spear boosts the poise of its wielder. So I was talking smack about my friends, but they just saved me there. I can't figure out why Swordmaster puts his sign down here, though. That's one thing I really cannot figure out. A polearm with a sharp, hard-pronged head that inflicts thrust attacks. The lucerne is wielded overhand like a hammer. Okay. Nothing really lore significant there. I almost want to try and fight this guy up here by myself, but I'm also afraid that he's going to massacre us. So perhaps worthy of note that not only is this the only Lothric knight we find in the High Wall who is wearing blue as opposed to red, he is also seemingly standing there mourning, perhaps, these 2 Lothric knights who are wearing black or very dark blue instead of red. The rest of the Lothric knight, I want to say corpses, but there's no actual corpses there. Suits of armor, sans helmet. The rest of them we find throughout the High Wall they all have red capes. These 2 have black capes, or perhaps blue capes that have turned black over time. Although that wouldn't explain why his is still blue and not black. You can also get a hint from this angle that this knight has red eyes, which is something that I think is very significant, in that it seems to suggest or hints at the influence of the abyss, or of people or things or monsters who have been tainted by the abyss. This is not going to go well. No, friends! Slowly! Oh, crap. Good work, team. Good work. I like how they make sure, they give the enemy a few extra hits after they're dead to just make sure that they're actually dead. So yeah. The drop refined gem. A gem of infused titanite. Forged the weapons of Lothric knights. Used an infusion to create refined weapons. Refined weapons are difficult to wield properly and scale effectively with strength and dexterity. So again, maybe the fact that he drops this falls below the line of gameplay and story. And I know I haven't properly introduced this graph as of yet. So if you're new to this series and you didn't watch Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore before it, I will try to explain it in greater depth at some point soon. But for now, suffice it to say that the fact that this Lothric Knight drops a refined gem, I don't know if there's any story significance to that. I do think it's significant, however, that the two suits of armor that this hollow Lothric Knight, if indeed he has the capacity to do such a thing, that he seems to have been mourning those two suits of armor, which have black capes as opposed to the red ones we find everywhere else. And also something I have yet to mention, simply because they blend so well into the landscape here. But all of these pilgrims of Londor, who I'm not going to go into great depth about now, because obviously that's something we're going to be talking about starting with the Undead settlement. But yeah, very, very interesting, these pilgrims, all of whom are facing this way. So just as I mentioned earlier, with respect to the pilgrim butterflies and the hollow trees, how they all seem to be, or could potentially be reaching for a common spot. These pilgrims are no different, and in fact may be one and the same with the pilgrim butterflies. This statue depicts the beheading that we see later on, the self-beheading, so as to satiate the Basin of Vows, I guess. But yeah, that's something I don't really understand. There's some sort of ritual self-sacrifice going on here. But as JSF and Cassid have pointed out, whereas seppuku comes about because, you know, a warrior has been dishonored in some way, or that they've lost, and I'm probably butchering this explanation, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of impetus for this self-beheading that not only seems to be prevalent if we look at all of the suits of armor everywhere, although those could also be, they could have been beheaded at the hands of the Blue Knights, the Blue Lothric Knights, but, you know, to some degree it appears to be self-inflicted. So not only is there evidence of all these self-inflicted beheadings, but also statues erected in honor of that practice. And that's something I don't understand at all. But yeah, let's go talk to Emma. Worthy of note that the dancer seems to be somewhere, or is, not seems to be, she is somewhere in here, because if we attack Emma, then the dancer spawns. But we also don't see her anywhere. The same seems to be true to some degree of Vordt, because we enter the room, the boss room, as we'll see. Just wait! I thought you didn't want to fight Emma. Oh, I really have to test that now, because now I'm just super curious. I might not get to it in this episode, but I do want to try testing that, to see if you summon him if he actually enters the boss room to fight the dancer. And the dancer's allegiance is something that is also up in the air, but that's kind of besides the point I'm trying to make right now, and that is that the dancer is in here somewhere, but she's sort of camouflaged. The same seems to be true not only of Vordt, but also of the majority of the enemies that we find in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, suggesting that either they all have been granted the Obscuring Ring, or something, approximating the effects of the Obscuring Ring. But the Obscuring Ring is obviously tied to a different covenant, so I don't know. But that's something that we'll look at later on.
Unkindled One, head to the high wall's base. Go through the great gate and raise this banner to proceed. But beware, the dog keeps a close eye on things. The vile watchdog of the Boreal Valley.
So, again, I'm drawing attention to something that JSF and Cassativ drew my attention to, and that is the fact that she refers to the watchdog of the Boreal Valley as the vile watchdog of the Boreal Valley. And if Bloodborne is any indication, vile is not a term that a developer like FromSoft, coming from the culture they come from, vile is not a word that they throw around lightly. So there's obviously a great deal of dislike, if not outright hatred, that Emma has for Vordt, and possibly also for the dancer. Because when the time comes and we are warped here, after gathering the cinders of the other lords, she's sort of sitting there in a pool of her own blood, suggesting that the dancer is the culprit. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I did want to talk about the intro, but we're really running long on time, so I'll see if I can try to do that at the start of the comments segment. But for now, because I did want to repeat her dialogue from the previous episode, where she said that
You will not find the Lords of Cinder here. They have left, gone, to their journey homes, converging at the base of this castle.
First and foremost, she said that and so something that Cassativ and JSF were suggesting is that she's lying to us, but I don't think she's lying to us necessarily. And that is to say, she's saying that the lords are not here. They're gone.
To their journey homes, converging at the base of this castle.
So churn, meaning to agitate or turn in a machine in order to produce putter, of a liquid, move about vigorously. Cause liquid to move about vigorously, break up the surface of an area of ground. So that last definition seems to be the most applicable to the context in which she used the term. And she says that the homes are converging at the base of the castle. So, of several people or things come together from different directions so as to eventually meet, come from different directions and meet at a place, gradually change so as to become something similar or develop something in common, tend to meet at a point, approximate in the sum of its terms towards a definite limit. So the Lords of Cinder, their homes are converging at the base of the castle because they're not here and they need to be here in order to ensure that the Link of Fire is not threatened. So the landscape is, the first flame is pulling, which presumably, at least where we are now, is supposed to be under Lothric, under the base of the castle, because that makes sense. I don't know why Lothric itself would be the thing that is churning these lands and forcing them to converge at the base of the castle. That I wouldn't be able to explain, but you could very easily explain that being caused by the first flame. So just briefly, Centimeter Worm writes, something that I find very interesting about how Dark Souls 3 frames its setting with the concept of various lands converging. The implication to me is that the world itself is shrinking, that the universe is condensing itself as a means of self-preservation. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Big Crunch theory, but it's one of the many speculations on how the universe might end. The idea that eventually the universe's expansion reverses and it collapses into a singularity, which involves a lot of weird quantum physics. But what I find fascinating about how this relates to Dark Souls 3 in the game, we explore a world that is being crunched together by the very force that sustains the entire universe. The world is so old, literally everything is crumbling to ash, that in order to sustain what little is left, the first flame is pulling in towards it everything it can, almost like insulation, or perhaps just more mass that can be burned and keep the fire alive just a little bit longer. I love this idea because it adds an extra layer of claustrophobic tension, for me at least, and it gives us a tiny bit of insight into how the first flame works. It is the heart of the universe right now, but the world existed before the flame sprang to life. Now that the cycle has played out time and time again, for what may very well be uncountable years, the flame is not only consuming lords and undead and now unkindled ash, but also the entire world itself. This is the ultimate thesis of the game. The world is not only ending, but the rabid desire to keep it alive, to continually link the fire, is only hastening its eventual and total erasure. We have a world that will, regardless of how much we struggle, soon burn itself out under the weight of its own gravity. That is such a powerful and poignant metaphor, and it captures perfectly the true antagonistic force in the Souls games. The beings we fight are not the antagonists of these games. The crushing reality of the end of existence as we know it is. It's also the perfect setting for a game that's simultaneously trying to communicate how much agency and power that we do possess in our actual lives. For us to be able to make what we will of ourselves and the world we live in, even when we know that one day it will all be gone, is a very uplifting and encouraging message. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that comment from Centimeter Worm because I think it's brilliant, and I didn't really want to get into the cosmology of everything just yet, but that's a little hint of the type of stuff that we'll be discussing when that time comes. Because cosmology is obviously a huge can of worms that I don't want to open just yet. But returning to my point about her not necessarily lying to us, she says that the Lords of Sin are not here. And so you could look at that as she's lying because obviously Lothric is here, the Twin Princes are here. But they've renounced their lordship. They are not, technically speaking, they are not lords. So she wants you to go and collect the other lords first to prove that you're capable. But also she doesn't want to allow you to... She doesn't want to allow you to bring harm to Lothric, with whom she seems to have forged a connection as an attachment, as his wet nurse. And we'll talk about that later on, because again, we're running out of time. This is one of those things I prepared to talk for, but I prepared way too many things for this episode. I need to be better at exercising restraint in the future, but it makes sense. If the line of succession in this case is of the utmost importance. Under, normal feudalism, the line of succession is everything. But that's just, that was a cultural thing at the time. Just the way that the world was. Whereas this is not just line of succession in order so that the name lives on. Line of succession in order to ensure that the world doesn't end. And so all of this is to say that my understanding of lactation is not very good, but what little I know of it, I know that lactation can get in the way of ovulation. So if you're breastfeeding, you're less likely to be ovulating and thereby, and thus less likely to give birth to another child. So shortly after having just given birth to one. So Emma was tasked with being a wet nurse to Prince Lothric. And so in a way she's not lying because he's technically not a lord. She tasks us later with making him into a lord. But on the other hand, she is lying because it's clear that she has some sort of, she has affection for, she's attached to Prince Lothric because breastfeeding is a very, very personal, very intimate thing. A very special and wonderful and beautiful thing. And for one reason or another, wet nurses are a thing that exists. But again, with what little I know about breastfeeding and lactation and all this, that whole situation seems to suggest that, yeah, she cares a great deal for Prince Lothric. So if she's lying, I think that's why. But I think you could also make a case that she's not necessarily lying. I'm sorry, friends. You guys have just been running on the spot that... They're so upset with me. Like, nope. Not even gonna look at you. Alright, team. Oh, you guys gonna let me through? Thank you. Let's go take on Vordt. So note that as we enter the boss room, that just as... No, wait a second. Okay, maybe I was wrong, because these knights also seem to be wearing black. Or maybe it's just the lighting. I don't know. What the heck do I know? I don't really know anything. Okay. But yeah, so note that just like the dancer, and just like basically anything in the game that has an obscuring ring, or anyone in the game that has an obscuring ring, Vordt seems to be camouflaged when we first enter the boss room. And it's possible that the specific example I'm thinking of, and that is after the cutscene, if you turn around, you don't see him for a couple seconds. And that could just be a graphical glitch, but it could also imply that he's using some sort of obscuring ring type thing. If not the obscuring ring itself, something which approximates its effect. Guys, you can look at me. I'm not... Because, yeah, we don't see Vordt anywhere here. So I think we're going to leave it there for now and head back to Firelink Shrine. Soul of Boreal Valley, Vordt. Vordt served as an outrider knight, never far from the fleeting dancer. So yeah, not a heck of a lot to go by there, and we won't have the additional item descriptions until we get the transposing kiln, either in the next episode or the episode after that. But that's very cool. I think this is unique to this spot here, where you can see the embers sort of flying away from us as a result of the wind from having opened the door. That's really, really cool. Cool little detail I never noticed before. So that's where we're going to be going for the next episode. And they're much, much later. Oh, I want to just start recording it now, but I'm not even close to being ready. So let's just head back to Firelink. So first and foremost, I just want to say again, thank you all kindly for leaving so many wonderful, insightful, kind, and thoughtful comments on the previous episode. Unfortunately, as usual, that also means that I won't be able to get to everyone, so if you're among those whose comments I don't address in the forthcoming comment segment, do know that I appreciate it, and that's not a reflection on you either way. There are too many comments, I can't get to them all. So I do hope that you understand. With that said, the first comment I wanted to address comes from Nusarnak. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the portion of the comment I wanted to address is in the postscript, which says, stating the positions you lean in outright, that is your SJW-ness, is a very risky venture. People might think that your analysis will be heavily influenced by your views and be used as an avenue to parrot your beliefs, as it were. Yeah. People might think that, but that's the way the world works. There are no uninfluenced beliefs. So of course they're going to think that my analysis is heavily influenced by my views, but everyone's analysis is heavily influenced by their views. There's no such thing as an apolitical or a truly 100% objective analysis. It doesn't exist. Does not exist. And I know that Nusarnak isn't arguing to the contrary here, and I'm very grateful for this comment, because it attuned me to the fact that I needed to articulate myself a little bit more clearly with respect to my personal situatedness, and how that affects the shape and the texture and the structure of this series, but also how I run my channel. And that fact crystallized even further when, about an hour after I added this comment to the list of comments I wanted to address for this episode, I received this one. Beginning with apparently a quotation from the episode in which this comment was left. Anything racist or sexist. Confirmed cultural Marxist. What you mean is anything that conflicts with your inculcated hard left conditioning. Why can't people leave their shitty politics out of games? So we're going to address all the things that are wrong with this comment in a moment. But in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about pedagogy. So that is the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. I'm not studying education, but pedagogy constitutes one of my primary interests. And the way in which this series is structured is pedagogical through and through. I've approached it from a pedagogical perspective. The very nature of the series is informed by pedagogical ideas that I like and that I find compelling, but also because pedagogy doesn't just apply to educational contexts, it applies at large as well. And in order to explain what I mean, we're going to be talking really briefly about an article called Time for Action, Science Education for an Alternative Future by Derek Hodson of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And this is from the International Journal for Science Education, all the details for which will be in the video description below. So quoting Hodson, one of the absurdities of some current curriculum initiatives is that they show how scientific inquiry is influenced by the socio-cultural context in which it is located, but do not use this understanding to politicize students. Many teachers avoid confronting the political interests and social values underlying the scientific and technological practices they teach about, and seek to avoid making judgments about them or influencing students in particular directions. This makes little or no sense. Values are embedded in every aspect of the curriculum. Content, teaching, learning methods, and assessment and evaluation strategies are selected using criteria that reflect and embody particular value positions, whether teachers recognize it or not. Moreover, values can be promoted as much by what is omitted from discussion as by what is included. So that was Hodson, and this is from a reflection I wrote in part on this article, so I'm quoting myself here. Though I am loath to describe any fact as being unassailable, it can scarcely be denied that education is deeply and inherently political. And yet, as Derek Hodson points out, the prevailing view, widely shared among those responsible for curricula design, holds that education can and should be neutral with respect to values. On this view, dominant values, including that which paradoxically values value neutrality, are not values at all. Thus, for many of these individuals, the value-neutral curriculum is not only that which reifies the dominant value system, but also that which ensures our ongoing collective inability to identify these values as values. Indeed, as Hodson goes on to argue, values are not merely embedded in every aspect of the curriculum, they are also promoted as much by what is omitted from discussion as by what is included. So again, the context for that article and my reflection on it was curriculum design and education in general. But it equally applies here because any decision I make with respect to things to cover or not cover is itself a political decision. So in a way you could look at my approach to this series as sort of a curriculum. And the idea of the curriculum is something that I find incredibly problematic, but that's not something we'll get into here. But just for the purposes of this particular discussion, we'll look at my approach to this series and my plan for it as a curriculum that I've been developing. So if I were to say avoid talking about issues of gender or class or race, then by deciding to omit those topics from discussion, that is itself a political decision. It is a value statement. And so all of this is to say that when this person says, why can't people leave their shitty politics out of games? The only reason this person sees the things I was saying as shitty politics or as politics in general is because they don't recognize their own position, their own values as values, nor do they recognize their own politics as politics. Everything is political. And so to insert discussion of political matters, of contentious and controversial matters, into a video game isn't to graft it onto something where it doesn't belong, because video games themselves are political. Video games raise political issues. They have politics. These games aren't programmed by disembodied spirits. Video games are programmed, they're marketed, they are tied to, they are embedded in politics. They don't exist outside of politics. So when someone says, why can't people leave their shitty politics out of games? What they're suggesting is that games are apolitical. And this suggestion is made on the basis, I think, of their inability to recognize their own politics as politics, their own values as values. So what's more is this person, on the basis of apparently 4 words I said, jumps to the conclusion that I am a cultural Marxist, which I'm not. Confirmed cultural Marxist, this person says. I find many Marxist ideas interesting and useful in understanding the world and understanding political economy, but I also find the ideas of Michel Foucault very useful and very valuable in understanding the world. And often those two are opposed to each other. A lot of my work is also informed by anthropology, my work is informed by feminist technoscience. There are so many different aspects to the things I'm interested in and my personal values that you don't get to do this. You don't just get to say on the basis of 4 words that someone has said. You don't get to brand them as something. That's not how it works. Or at least that might be how it works elsewhere, but we're not doing that here. So this is a subject that I could ramble on and on and on about, but I'm not going to do that here, just because, again, we're running low on time. Suffice it to say that if I consciously opted not to broach subjects of race or sex or gender or whatever so offended this person, then that too would be a political decision. So either way, it's a political thing. So to be incredulous about people bringing politics into games is to misunderstand what politics is, or it reflects an inability to recognize one's own values as values, and one's own politics as politics, simply because they share a common value system with the vast majority of people. No one can exist in a completely neutral space. No one exists in a vacuum. Everyone has values, everyone has politics. And to include or omit something from discussion, it doesn't matter which of those two you do, they are both political acts. But with all that said, I would highly recommend that you check out a video titled Keep Your Politics Out of My Video Games by Errant Signal. I've mentioned Errant Signal a few times on this channel. I don't think in the context of Let's Talk Lore though, so I would highly recommend that you check it out, because it's an excellent and incredibly insightful and thoughtful analysis of this notion that one should keep politics out of video games. But with that aside, moving on. Scion95 writes, about the institution of linking the fire. I sort of feel like there's always basically been an institution or committee of linking the fire, because that's basically what Frant and Gwendolyn were doing in Dark Souls 1. The Way of Weight that worships the god seem to be responsible for the Undead Asylum and all the rigorous challenges there, and it seems like the gods of Lordran were responsible for Sen's Fortress and the like, and that the Silver/Giant Knights and Ornstein and Smo were still answering to Gwendolyn/the illusory Guinevere. So Scion95 went on to bring up the Lord Vessel, and Rince wrote that you don't need the Lord Vessel to link the fire in Dark Souls 2 or 3. And so this comment is technically correct, but I did want to raise an alternative possibility, that we do use the Lord Vessel to access the Kiln of the First Flame, just as we do in Dark Souls 1, except that the Lord Vessel is us. So recall that one of the definitions we looked at for vessel was a hollow container, especially one used to hold liquid such as a bowl or cask. But look at what happens when the Lords of Cinder are returned to their thrones. The Lords of Cinder all burn, or their cinders at least burn, and then their power is transferred into, I believe, what the Firekeeper describes us as the new air. And then she baptizes us with it. So in a way, the Lord Vessel is still needed, but we are the Lord Vessel. We are a hollow container into which the power of flame from the other Lords of Cinder are placed. It's obviously not airtight. There are a few leaps of logic involved there, but I did want to raise this possibility because thanks to Rince Witness's comment, I started thinking about it, and then the vessel definition popped on my mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're the Lord Vessel. It's not actually a vessel anymore. We are literally the Lord Vessel. We are a hollow container. And we are filled via this strange baptism-type ceremony with the power of the Lords of Cinder. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, the Lord Vessel needs to be filled to open the door to the Kiln of the First Flame. In Dark Souls 3, those souls, instead of being placed in a vessel, are infused in our body. And then we black out, and when we wake up, we're in the Firelink Shrine near the Kiln of the First Flame. So again, not airtight, but I did want to raise that possibility because it is one that intrigues me very, very much, and I'm interested to hear if the same is true for any of you. Precursor writes, I haven't thought about it too much before viewing this, but when you talked about what would happen if the lords were at their thrones and everything hypothetically went according to plan, and I don't know why it skipped my mind so easily, but us, as the player character, along with the Lords of Cinder, were all dead in graves. But as the link of fire was threatened, we all awoke to the bell. What the hell happened in between the time we all woke up? Why the hell is Aldrich up in Anor Londo and Yorn down in the Profane Capital, which are the furthest things away from any graveyard or tomb? I understand why things didn't go according to plan. The lords had their own agendas, but where the heck did they even crawl out of? In the opening cutscene, you'd think from the surroundings that they all came from the Cemetery of Ash, but that's close to impossible, as the distance between locations is too great to travel in any reasonable amount of time, especially without causing a lot of damage to the land as a huge-ass giant, a blob of skeletons, a legion of dog lovers, and the twins go to their corresponding homes. I'm willing to say that the Legion came from the Catacombs of Carthus, although the surrounding area in the cutscene looks nothing like the area. And I'm also willing to believe the princes came from the untended graves, or maybe just died in their throne room. But the others are kinda nonsensical unless anyone has some ideas. But something else that Kassadov and JSF posited in discussing Dark Souls 3 is that the sarcophagus in Firelink Shrine could very well be that of Ludleth, which would explain how he got there so quickly, but also would be consistent with the fact that Courland, his homeland, seems to have been destroyed. And I believe Ludleth is also referred to at one point or another as Ludleth the Exiled. So, I don't know. The intro cinematic is something that I've still not fully figured out myself. So, even though it's partially appeared in the last 2 episodes, but it's still something I'm thinking about. In particular, about whether or not the scenes of them awaking from their coffins are supposed to be taken literally, or if they're just supposed to be sort of abstract. Because yeah, as is mentioned by Precursor, the areas in which we see 2 of the Lords awakening at least, don't seem to match the surroundings of any in-game area that we can find that would make sense. So I'm not sure. Astora, I think that's pronounced. Sorry if I screwed that up. Writes, something I've been pondering for the longest time. When you die in-game, there's the infamous "you died" screen. However, the chosen undead and unkindled ash are presumably already dead, no? This raises several questions, primarily about how death is handled for characters who are already undead. When we kill Solaire or Henri, they seem to die for good. So how can undead be killed, and why are we, the player character, reborn at bonfires? Can it be dismissed as merely a gameplay necessity, or is there a lore-related explanation? So I had originally intended to go into my full usual explanation. If you've been around for a while, you probably know which explanation I'm referring to, about the difference between capital H hollowing and lowercase h hollowing. But given the length of the episode already, I'm not going to get into it, except to say that as we approach the end of Henri's questline, this is something that I will go into great depth to try and explain. So I hope you can hold off until then, at least for my explanation. But in the meantime, Sebastian replied and wrote, "It could be a self-realization. Seeing you died could be a visual representation of hollowing. The constant reminder that you are no longer you, and with every death that fact becomes clearer and clearer. You died may not be referring to the boss fight you just lost or the fall from the cliff you just took, but to the very first death your character experienced, the one that made them undead." So that is fascinating to me. It's a little bit harder to make this apply in the case of Dark Souls 3, I think, simply because as unkindled ash, and the nature of the player character is still something that we have to really explore. We haven't really touched on it at all. But recall that we're described as unkindled ash, unfit to even be cinder. And so I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, because again, that's another can of worms that would lengthen the episode longer than it's already excessive length. But yeah, that is something we're going to get into. But I did want to point out that unlike in the previous games where we were undead essentially from the outset, we could have been dead for centuries. We have no idea how long the Ashen One has been dead for. But we were raised because basically there was no one else. So we became undead long after dying, presumably. Whereas in the previous games, we found ourselves in the position we were in precisely because we were undead. So there's a different sequence of events there in Dark Souls 3 versus Dark Souls 1 or 2 that is worth keeping in mind, I think. Billy Westwood writes, "I think if everything went according to plan, and the lords were all at their thrones, we would have been able to defeat the Soul of Cinder, since Udex Gundir is a test of skill, so you would be reasonably good at fighting, but also in traveling to the kiln of the First Flame. You gain the power and strength of the lords in flame, so we would be very powerful when we arrive at the kiln. I think this is for 2 reasons. In all the Lord of Cinder boss fights, the lords gain the strength of flame and become a lot more powerful. And if you imagine getting all their power at once, you would become very strong. And in this situation of lords' cooperation, I presume the lords would die, which would grant you all their souls at once, which would again give you immense power and strength, since more souls basically makes you stronger, so you would be strong enough when you reach the Soul of Cinder." So I think that's very well put, very, very well put, and certainly leaves me feeling a bit more satisfied about the present Plan B-ness of everything in the story. That the Plan A seems to make sense, if you put it like this. I think you could look at this as something similar to in Bloodborne, how over a certain amount of insight, you can see the false gods, you can see the amygdalae, all over, say, Odin Chapel, before the Blood Moon, before defeating Rom. But then after you defeat Rom, it doesn't matter what your insight is. You see the blood moon, you see all these things that otherwise, you hear the cries of Murgo, all things that you would have had to have a certain amount of insight in order to see prior to that. So I think we could look at this hypothetical Plan A situation as something very similar. That just as in Bloodborne, when you pass a certain point of the game, I think VaatiVidya was the first one to coin this term, but the notion of plot insight, and I guess that's useful to put it that way. So in this case, it would be, I guess, plot levels, plot soul levels, plot power, that once you are at the kiln, because obviously things didn't go according to plan, we're in Plan B, and so it's kind of a foregone conclusion that you would have enough souls to, you would be strong enough at that point. But in the hypothetical situation wherein Plan A worked and everyone returned, it makes sense that, when we gain the strength of the lords, when we're baptized, as we just covered by the Firekeeper, that we would all of a sudden become much, much, much stronger. So very similar to the notion of plot insight in Bloodborne, I think. Cyan95 writes, perhaps part of the reason Andre doesn't say he hopes we don't go hollow is that we won't. Unkindled don't seem to hollow if left to their own devices unless certain other things happen first. Our safety as an Unkindled isn't in any danger. At worst, we'll give up and get lazy and sit around like Hawkwood. So the most Andre would have to fear would be his work being wasted, not necessarily us coming to harm. So that is a very good point. A very, very good point. I still think that the sentiment of what he's saying is perhaps what matters a little bit more, but that is a very fair point, and it comes back to what I was just saying about the nature of the Unkindled One, or of the Ashen One, whatever the terminology is that we're going to use. I think we'll just stick with Ashen One, because it rolls off the tongue much easier, I think. Yeah, the nature of the Ashen One is very, very different from that of the Chosen Undead in Dark Souls 1, and the Bearer of the Curse, or whatever we were called, in Dark Souls 2. So yeah, very, very good point. So something else that I wanted to test, but it appears as though Apex has already tested it, and that is, if you bring a Winged Knight near Lothric Knights, they do not fight each other. Not sure if that's an oversight on FromSoft's part, or if that is meant to imply something very different than a civil war. Maybe those empty sets of armor are more in protest than in defeat. If you go to the Shrine Handmaiden and sell her face-plated rings, you may notice the price of the rings differ. The Knights and Hunters rings sell for about 300 souls, whereas the Scholar and Maiden rings sell for 1,000. With Goddard helping you fight Lords of Cinder and the Katana Blackhand body in front of the archives, with the key on him and Goddard's weapon on him, what if the Knights and Black Hands are rebelling against Lothric as a whole? Maybe the Winged Knights are the ones who left the empty sets of armor on the ground. A theory I had a while ago, but one that is stretching somewhat far. Well, far-fetched or otherwise, I do think it's very interesting, and I thank you kindly for sharing. Especially with respect to the discrimination, with respect to the amount of souls particular merchants will give you for certain items. Because if you recall in Dark Souls 1, the only merchant to which you could sell items in Dark Souls 1 was Kingseeker Fran. And by way of an example, anything related to crystal, he would give you, I think, 1 soul for. So, in other words, anything related to Seath the Scaleless, who he did not like. So it's interesting that, once again, we see something very similar here. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out, because that's something that I think we should all think about. Sean Quinn writes, is it possible that instead of there being an endless stream of enemies, you simply return to a time before they were killed? After all, time is convoluted in Souls games. So it's possible, yes, but I think the whole notion of time being convoluted is problematic in a way that the notion of, and again returning to Bloodborne, so I apologize if you're unfamiliar with the lore of Bloodborne, but I do think it's relevant, and that is the notion of Odin being formless. Odin, the formless Great One, and this is something that JSF covered in his very extensive episode of Bloodborne Up Close on Odin, where he kind of expressed some frustration about the fact that, or maybe this was privately, him and I talking, I'm not sure. He's expressed frustration in the past with the fact that because Odin is stated to be a formless Great One, that several people in the community kind of use that as a catch-all as a result. Well, we can't explain this, but Odin is formless, so therefore it's Odin. And I think that we need to be similarly cautious with the notion that time is convoluted, because though that could be made to apply to a number of questions in Dark Souls 3, I do think that the less we rely on that line of reasoning, the better. And that is to say that time is convoluted is a much more complex and complicated solution to a problem that might have much easier, more simple, more compelling solutions instead. So again, it's possible, but I don't think it's necessary. I think that we shouldn't invoke time is convoluted except in, the most dire of circumstances where we just don't know. And in this case, in the case of respawning enemies, it's much simpler and I think much more compelling to just say that there are more of them, as opposed to saying that when you return to a bonfire, you return to a time before they were killed. Because what if there's a unique enemy among those enemies? Why doesn't the unique enemy return? Because then it would make every enemy infinite respawn. So yeah, again, last resort, time is convoluted. As far as I'm concerned, it should be seen as sort of a last resort in explanatory terms. Owner Ayaz, again, apologies for the mispronunciations, but Owner Ayaz writes, I can't help but think about those hollow trees now. They're so fascinating. I don't think I have a clear answer to what they are, but I can propose a few ideas and thoughts I've come up with. First and foremost is that I looked around for some Japanese myths related to trees, and all I could stumble upon was the Jaboko tree, or the vampire tree. According to Wiki and other sources I found, that the Jaboko seems to sprout or appear in battlefields where many have previously died. It's said to look like any ordinary tree because it lives off fresh blood. One final thing I want to point out is apparently they suck the blood out by changing their branches into tubes. I want to point out that a vampire tree is an interesting idea because of how it appears the hollows have fused with the trees, almost as if they were never fully absorbed. They also look as if they've been sucked dry of their blood, but that could just be due to starvation. So this is an interesting point because I think it applies not only to the hollow trees, but also to the cursed rotted greatwood. And I believe that that's something that JSF and Cassid have suggested as well in their discussing Dark Souls 3 videos, but I can't recall, so we'll return to this either in the next episode or the episode after that. But thank you for this very prescient comment. Owner goes on to write that I wanted to think about their symbolic placement. Trees are generally meant to look healthy, but these trees look as if they're decaying and dead. Building on the idea of a vampire tree, I think it's in this hollow tree state, maybe because if it were trying to absorb the blood or souls of the undead, then maybe like a tree it could have also been infected by the Pus of Man and killed, leaving it in a vegetative state. I hope this was able to give you more ideas about the trees and their significance, because even if the vampire tree idea is false, I think we can glean that if they are in fact some spirit-like entity, it might explain all the worshipping hollows, and it may reflect the state of Lothric, dead rampant with hollows in a state of chaos. I think this applies to the comments in general. Don't be afraid of being wrong. So even if this particular reference is not applicable in the end, even if we discover that it's not relevant, it's still something to think about. And when we think about these things, our minds make connections to other things. And so all comments of this sort are useful. So in general, just don't be afraid of being wrong. It's all good. Yosaho provided some very helpful but also tentative guidance with respect to the original Japanese text and some of the terms that I was confused about in the first couple of episodes. So first, umbral ashes, translating roughly to the remains of bones after cremation. Sovereignless souls, soul without an owner. The Firekeeper's dialogue about the mark of ash. So I believe she said, follow the mark of ash and it will lead you to the high wall. Seems to be mistranslated. It should be like this. Produce the coiled sword at the bonfire. That is a proof of ashes. So presumably proof that we defeated Udex Gundyr. Then you will be guided to Lothric, where the homes of the lords converge. Yosaho added that I'm not finished checking everything in the game yet, let alone stuffs related to this episode. I have to say that Dark Souls 3 suffers from some translation issues, and I think I will continue addressing them throughout this Let's Talk lore. That would be utterly fantastic and amazing, and any help you can provide for us in this way is greatly, 100%, immeasurably appreciated, so thank you very much for this. Sisyphean Soul writes that when Dark Souls 3 came out, I was actually working on Hobbes, the political theory of Thomas Hobbes for some exams, and I remember wondering if it could have any relevance to the lore of Dark Souls 3. Now with all your remarks on the institution of Link in the Fire, I start to wonder if it could actually help understand how this institution works. I'm not saying it's based on Hobbes' political theory, neither am I, to be clear, but maybe this theory could shed some light, be it by contrast, on the rules of the institution of Link in the Fire. Sisyphean's soul goes on to write, if the lords abandon their thrones, and we accept the idea that the first flame is manipulating space so as to pull them back towards itself, in order to make sure that the fire is linked once more, we can probably infer that it manages to do so thanks to the lord's former sacrifice when they linked the fire. So in some way, they gave part of their power to the flame. Now, according to Hobbes, the state, or the Leviathan, is the result of a contract between individuals according to which they give up some part of their power to a third party, so that this third party has the strength to ensure the individual's safety. Again, according to Hobbes, that's the moment when the law emerges. Before that, there is no right or wrong, just every individual's natural right to do everything it can in order to survive. It follows that there neither is such things as subjects, a multitude, or any kind of legal rights outside of the Leviathan. Also, it's important to note that even in the Leviathan, subjects' rights, so that is the right of subjects, are very limited. It's really unclear whether Hobbes gives absolute power to the state as it ensures security, the most important state function, according to Hobbes. At this point, there's some kind of conundrum in Hobbes' theory that starts to take shape. If there is no law outside of the Leviathan, then the moment one decides to leave the community, the state has the absolute power to do whatever it wants if it feels you threaten it. The moment you even take the slightest step outside of its realm, it has the power and the right to take you back in, thanks to the countless subjects that gave up their power to ensure their safety. Coming back to Dark Souls, it seems as though the first flame, over time and over multiple linkings of the fire, has grown stronger and stronger thanks to individuals giving up part of their power to it to ensure some kind of world balance. And it now has the power to distort space and time in order to enforce its prerogative. To me, sounds a lot like Hobbes' Leviathan. Now, it's obviously more complicated, but there are other parallels that are interesting. Hobbes imagined his theory in the midst of civil wars, and it seems there has been some civil war in Lothric. Also, as there are multiple lords sitting at Firelink Shrine, maybe we can imagine there were different shrines, but over time they built some kind of federation or union. I don't know, I just think about the possibility because Hobbes' theory explains the genesis of the state, and today some authors try to use this theory to envision the genesis of the European Union. I'm not sure what to make of all this, nor if it's even interesting, but maybe it could help in understanding how things came to be as they are in Dark Souls 3, and the connections with the other two games. So I am very, very grateful that you brought this up and that you provided us with this incredibly helpful précis and comparison to the story of Dark Souls, because it does seem to be relevant in a way that I didn't expect it to be when I first brought it up. My understanding of Thomas Hobbes in general and Leviathan in particular is informed largely by my having read Leviathan and the Air Pump, Hobbes, Boyle, and the Experimental Life by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer, which is regarded as one of the seminal texts of my field. It's an incredibly interesting and, I think, incredibly insightful and apt text which analyzes Thomas Hobbes in a context in which, prior to this book having been published, I believe in the late 70s, no one had considered Thomas Hobbes in the context of the history of science and technology. But what they did is they revisited Hobbes through the lens of the restoration debate concerning the nature and the bases of assent in society. So how do we make decisions as a collective? And you see the original cover of the book is very clever in that it shows the same frontispiece from Leviathan, but whereas in the frontispiece for Leviathan, the Sovereign is holding a sword in the right hand and a crozier in the left hand. On the cover for Leviathan and the Air Pump, the Sovereign is holding a sword in the right hand and the air pump on the left. The air pump of Robert Boyle represents the shift from the quest for absolute notions of truth. And that is because whereas Thomas Hobbes was very particular about philosophical language, because he thought that insofar as we don't use proper definitions, and insofar as we don't see problems through to their ultimate conclusions, then we are courting further disorder. Whereas from the perspective of Robert Boyle and his contemporaries at the Royal Society, they abandoned a project of trying to pursue universal truth. And what they settled on instead was a probabilistic notion of truth. And so, long story short, because again, this episode is going to be really long, Shapin and Schaffer looked at this debate that almost no one had written about previously between Hobbes and Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle referred to his air pump as creating a vacuum. And Thomas Hobbes rightly pointed out, no, it's not a vacuum. It is literally impossible for you to have a vacuum inside of that air pump. And the ultimate resolution went in favor of Robert Boyle, in that the standards for the nature and bases of assent in society was left up to a probabilistic notion of truth. Whereas Thomas Hobbes, at least in my reading of this particular text, again, I've not read Leviathan, but Thomas Hobbes was firmly against this. And he argued that to abandon this pursuit of absolute truth and to settle for a probabilistic notion of truth instead wouldn't be a solution to problems of social order and science, but instead would be a recipe for continued disorder. So yeah, maybe I'll talk about this more if people are interested, and I'll actually look at some of the précis I've written, so that because that was just completely off the cuff from my memory. It's been several months since I've last read this text, because I have read it several times. But yeah, if anyone's interested, let me know, and perhaps we'll go more into Leviathan and the air pump, where it's relevant to the story of Dark Souls 3. But in the meantime, thank you very kindly, Sisyphean Soul, for your incredibly apt and thoughtful comment. And thank you to everyone in general for, even if I didn't read your comment here, again, I apologize, I sincerely apologize. My largest source of anxiety in making these videos is tied to my not wanting anyone to feel left out, or for anyone to feel lesser about themselves because I didn't read their comment. More often than not, it's just happenstance. And just know once again that I appreciate all your comments very, very, very much. But that's going to do it for this episode. Next time we're going to be venturing into the Undead settlement. I haven't yet decided whether or not we're going to spend 2 episodes at the Undead settlement or 1. Judging by the current pace of the series, I would wager that 2 is more likely. So if you would like to leave forward-looking comments, that's fine. You are more than welcome to. Just keep in mind that we will likely fight the Curse-Rotted Greatwood in the next episode, and then in the episode after that, we'll deal with Siegvard and his questline, and then end the episode on our way to the Road of Sacrifices. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about what's coming and for anything that we discuss in this episode. But thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.